Have you ever wondered why Hitler is so universally and unanimously considered the most evil person to have ever existed? There's no denying that the Holocaust is one of the most atrocious crimes against humanity ever. But we've had many horrible things happen over the course of human history. Wars, genocide, slavery. Some were arguably more brutal, some even killed more people. It wasn't the first time millions of people were killed, it wasn't the last, and unless we learn from history and change course fast, it could certainly happen again, especially with the way things are going right now. One incredibly important historical detail people tend to overlook is that the Holocaust didn't happen that long ago in the grand scheme of things. Less than 100 years ago, 84 to be exact. This is a blink of an eye in the context of all human history. To put this into perspective, let's imagine the entire 10,000 years of human history was condensed into one 24-hour day. And let's say right now the year 2025 is midnight on this 24-hour clock. At what time of the day would you estimate the Holocaust occurred? 10 p.m.? 11 maybe? The answer is 11:48 p.m. It happened less than a 15-minute coffee break ago on the 24-hour clock of human civilization. The reason this is so significant is because this wasn't the Middle Ages or the caveman era we're talking about here. This wasn't the result of people straight up just being primitive, ignorant, or uneducated. Germany was considered one of the most educated, literate, and civilized societies in the world at the time. It wasn't like the Middle Ages where witch burning happened because people were just dumb and uneducated and didn't know how science worked. They weren't all that different from us, to be honest, and that's what makes it scary. Now, you might be wondering at this point, what is this Gen Z YouTube channel doing making a video about the Holocaust? Good question, actually. It all began with a comment on one of my videos. The evolution arguments are literal social Darwinianism. It's the core of Nazi ideology. Never let anyone get away with that argument without calling them a fascist, because they are. So, to give some context on this, I've been advocating for universal basic income in my videos for quite some time now, and one common counter argument I always see against it is that people think that those who can't get a job should simply be left on the streets to starve because, well, this is just nature and evolution running its course. The strong survive and the weak get weeded out of existence. That's just how it is in nature. After I read this comment, I decided to do some digging, and I went down a very heavy, dark, and disturbing rabbit hole. Needless to say, this is a very heavy subject, and I wasn't even sure if I could bring myself to make this video after everything I learned. But after seeing these scary resemblances to a lot of the rhetoric going on right now, I felt compelled to do so because, as the saying goes, those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. The first event that set up the butterfly effect sequences which ultimately led to the Holocaust was the Great Depression. You may have noticed that these two events happened very close to each other in history, and this is no coincidence. Germany had already lost World War I. Its economy was in shambles. Unemployment skyrocketed to over 30%. Hyperinflation ran rampant, most famously in the Weimar Republic, where a loaf of bread, which only cost 250 marks in January of 1923, would end up costing over 200,000 million marks by November 1923. By the fall of 1923, the cost of printing a note was more than the note itself was worth. Nobody could get a job. Nobody could afford anything. People were being pushed to the absolute limit financially. Does this all sound scarily familiar? Then the Great Depression swept the globe, and things got worse. Much worse. The unemployment rate hit 30%, which is very similar to the real unemployment rate today. And as you'd expect, youth unemployment was even higher. People lost their businesses, went hungry, and as a result, were desperate for a solution. Any solution. Their sheer desperation caused them to seek out extreme solutions for their extreme problems. And as a result, the political center was abandoned, and extremist parties on both ends rapidly gained traction. Communism on the left, fascism on the right. Once again, does this not sound all too scarily familiar? In the late 1920s, Hitler had already been making a name for himself. He was a charismatic public speaker and an expert at crowd manipulation. He was already pulling in crowds of thousands of people with vitriolic speeches railing against the Jews and the Marxists. His political manifesto, Mein Kampf, had already sold hundreds of thousands of copies. Then the Great Depression hit. People lost everything and became hopeless. And this is when Hitler sensed his golden opportunity and struck. You see, somebody had to take the blame for this. Somebody had to be the scapegoat. And we all know that in the end, 6 million Jews paid for it with their lives. They were the last and the final scapegoat. But what you might not have learned in history class was they weren't the first. 1920s Germany was not the Dark Ages. People were not just a bunch of backwards thinking primitive cavemen. They were very educated and sophisticated. How on earth did they end up voting for and accepting gas chambers and concentration camps? Well, the answer is it didn't happen overnight. It wasn't like Hitler could just show up one day, be like, hey, you know what, guys? My plan is to just commit mass genocide and kill 6 million Jews for absolutely no reason at all. Who wants to vote for me? No, it happened in gradual, incremental steps where you move 1 inch at a time. And before you know it, you're a mile away from where you started. Germany was in total chaos after the conclusion of World War I. The country was left in shambles, broken, and humiliated. This created a power vacuum and the perfect breeding grounds for extreme ideologies from both sides to take hold. In 1917, the Russian Revolution had just succeeded, leading to the birth of the Soviet Union, the largest communist experiment to date. A young Hitler watched from afar and feared that something similar could happen in Germany. 2 years later, it nearly did. In 1919, Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht founded the Communist Party of Germany. They were inspired by the Russian Revolution and believed that Germany needed to follow a similar path. So they organized a mass strike and demonstration amongst discontent workers to overthrow capitalism and implement a Soviet-esque worker government. The number of workers who turned out for these strikes far exceeded their expectations. 100,000 people showed up. For the next 7 days, protesters stormed government buildings, printing presses, and newspaper publications. The German government then called in the Freikorps, violent right-wing paramilitaries made up of World War I veterans, to crush the uprising. Freikorps were military trained and armed to the teeth with flamethrowers, mortars, machine guns, and artillery. The communist protesters stood no chance. They opened fire, and the result was 150 to 200 casualties. The uprising was brutally crushed. After the failed uprising, Luxemburg and Liebknecht went into hiding, fearing for their lives. Their luck wouldn't last. They were found and murdered by the Freikorps just a few days later. It's important to note that the communists were not totally innocent, peaceful protesters in this situation either. They unlawfully took over many government buildings and private businesses by force, and generally speaking, just planned the revolution very poorly. The after effects of the Spartacus Uprising had a profound impact on Hitler and the German public. It became increasingly clear that the two dominant ideologies at the time, communism and fascism, simply could not coexist. Communists were far left, anti-nationalist, and believed in class equality. Nazis, on the other hand, were far right, extremely nationalist, and believed in racial hierarchies. Communists represented by far the biggest opposition to Hitler's plan for a Nazi takeover of Germany, and so step one was to eliminate them by any means necessary. 14 years later, the perfect opportunity finally presented itself. On February 27, 1933, the German parliament building known as the Reichstag building was suddenly lit on fire. By the time police and firefighters arrived, the building was already engulfed in flames. The police conducted a thorough search and found a young 24-year-old Dutch communist by the name of Marinus van der Lubbe inside the building. The arson was immediately pinned on him, and a year later, he was executed. The exact details around what happened and whether he actually started the fire remains very unclear up until this day. The evidence available was very circumstantial at best. The most right-wing theory is that he was part of a broader communist conspiracy group working together, and the most left-wing theory is that the Nazis actually started the fire themselves as a false flag operation and pinned it on him. Now, the general consensus amongst most historians is somewhere in the middle. Most experts on the issue believe that he did in fact start the fire, but that he acted alone and wasn't part of a broader violent communist group. They don't believe the Nazis started the fire themselves, but they did absolutely exploit it for political gain. We will never know the exact truth, but it is worth noting that in 2007, the German government granted him a full posthumous pardon, fully exonerating him of the crime, as it was determined that Nazi trials were not exactly fair. Yeah, big surprise there. Nazis may have publicly reacted in disgust, but privately it was a different story. You can bet that they were absolutely brimming with glee and joy. You see, this arson took place just 6 days before the 1933 German election was set to occur. 6 days before Hitler was up for his very first election. The Nazis had spent months campaigning on a promise to save the nation from the evil communists. Once again, sound familiar? Whether the young Dutch communist actually started the fire or not, it provided the perfect watershed event for the Nazis. The timing literally could not have been better. Hitler would go on to win the election in an absolute landslide. Immediately after Hitler took office, he moved swiftly. On his second day as chancellor, Hitler opened his campaign with a nationwide radio address pledging to save the nation from the communists, which he castigated as political nihilism. In early February, Nazis unleashed a campaign of violence and terror that dwarfed anything we've seen so far. Sturmabteilung, stormtroopers, began attacking trade union and Communist Party offices and the homes of left-wingers. In March of 1933, the first concentration camp called Dachau was built, and the first prisoners sent there were not Jews. Not yet anyways. The very first prisoners of the very first Nazi concentration camp were in fact communists. Within weeks of Hitler taking office, thousands of communists were arrested, beaten, and sent to the camps. This laid the legal and physical foundations for the Nazi police state. And then Hitler realized something. With how much unbridled, unchecked power he achieved from demonizing the communists, why just stop at doing this to real, actual communists? Why not just accuse everyone who stands in your way and disagrees with you of being a communist, whether they actually are or not?
We got this from PolitiFact. Totally. New York City mayoral candidate Zoran Mdani is a communist.
Because he's the president, I want to give you a chance to respond directly to him. How do you respond? Are you a communist?
No.
First They Came by Martin Niemöller. First they came for the communists, and I did not speak out because I was not a communist. Then they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out for me.
If you follow my channel, you'll know that I'm a huge advocate for universal basic income. Don't worry, we're not going to get into UBI here, that's a different subject for a different video. Now, as I made more and more videos expressing my support for UBI, I started getting nonstop bombarded with accusations of being a communist. Now, I am someone who believes in presenting accurate information, so I did a little digging to see if UBI or even anything close to it was actually implemented or even proposed in any communist country. It wasn't. I was called a communist because I believe Gen Z is absolutely right in believing that we shouldn't be forced to work. So I started researching if any actual communist country believed in the same thing, and what I found was very, very interesting. Communist countries were every bit as work-obsessed as capitalist countries were, if not even more. In fact, there was an actual law in actual communist countries called social parasitism, which shamed, persecuted, and even criminalized people who didn't want to work. When I read this, I literally burst out laughing at the irony. The very same people who call Gen Z a bunch of lazy parasites for not wanting to work are literally spreading actual communist propaganda while calling you the communist. Mdani is not a communist, not just because he says he isn't. If you actually look at his policies, they're not even remotely close to that of a democratic socialist, let alone a communist. We've covered this in another video. Yet, despite this, the establishment media and his political opposition is so desperately trying to frame him as one. And I experienced the exact same thing. Haters of my channel were so desperate to prove UBI is communist that it got to this weird point where it was almost as if it was more important for them to prove UBI was communist than to prove it's actually even a bad policy. It was more important for them to label me a communist than it even was to prove my arguments were actually wrong. This insane, irrational obsession with calling everything you disagree with communist was very confusing to me until I made this video. After Hitler successfully took over on the backs of making communism the scapegoat, he realized that with how much people hated communism, if he simply slapped the communist label on all his political opposition, whether they were actually communist or not, he could convince the public that all these atrocious acts he committed, concentration camps, gas chambers, mass executions, were a necessary evil. And so he began trying to find ways to connect communism, not just to actual communists, but to anyone who opposed him. First on the chopping blocks were socialists, trade unionists, and everyone even remotely left-leaning. He was successful. Then it was time to bring out the big guns, the ultimate endgame, the group of people he despised the most from the very start, the Jews. Connecting the communist label to the Jews was easy pickings for Hitler. Rosa Luxemburg, the leader of the Spartacus Uprising we covered earlier, was a communist with strong Jewish roots, born into a Jewish family. Hitler would later go on to develop a myth and a conspiracy theory known as Judeo-Bolshevism or Jewish Bolshevism. They pushed out many lies and conspiracies in a desperate effort to get the public to associate Jews with communism. They claimed that the Russian Revolution of 1917 was actually a secret Jewish plot all along, that the Jews were secretly in control of the Soviet Union, and that they were secretly funding all these international communist movements behind closed doors in a covert attempt to destroy Western civilization. Once again, does this not sound scarily familiar? Due to all the economic hardship people were facing back then, sadly, it worked, and the rest is history. Millions of Jews were rounded up, transported to concentration camps, and executed in the most horrific, painful manner. And what happened next was what we know of today as the Holocaust. The Holocaust ended with 6 million deaths and the bloodiest conflict the world has ever seen. But it certainly didn't start that way. It started with exactly what you're seeing today. Dishonestly smearing everyone who disagrees with you as a communist. Being so fervently obsessed with labeling your opposition as communist that it becomes more important to prove they're a communist than to prove they're actually wrong. Anytime someone challenges the status quo, questions the system, or talks about inequality, they instantly and immediately get smeared as a communist. Not because they actually are one, but because the label itself is so emotionally loaded and historically demonized. The Nazis knew this very well and were brutally effective in their use of this strategy. And so do the neo-Nazi fascists who use this exact same tactic today. Let's circle back and answer the question we asked in the beginning of this video. Why is the Holocaust universally considered to be the worst crime against humanity ever? 6 million Jews were killed in the Holocaust, a staggering number without a doubt. But other genocides have killed similar amounts or even more. The overwhelming majority of wars and genocides in history came as a result of a fight over resources. When we have billions of people living on an earth with a limited amount of resources, we're inevitably going to have conflicts as we fight to secure our livelihoods and survival. Now, to be clear, this doesn't justify all the other wars and genocides by any means, but it does prove that in just about every other case, violence and killing was a means to an end and not the end goal itself. The Holocaust stands alone as the only major atrocity where the violence, the torture, the sheer hatred was not a means to acquire resources, but the actual end goal itself. The Nazis gained absolutely nothing, economically speaking, in their mass genocide of the Jews and the communists. They just killed them because they straight up hated them that much. In fact, in many instances, they even went out of their way, sacrificing precious resources during a war just to continue their killing. During the critical Battle of Stalingrad, Hitler actually redirected trains away from supplying German troops with valuable war supplies just so he could use them to continue transporting Jews to concentration camps. He spent millions building extermination camps, camps that existed solely for the purposes of killing with no labor component to them. This was a total waste of resources in a time where Germany was rapidly running out of oil, food, steel, and other key wartime resources. They gained absolutely nothing financially or economically speaking from the Holocaust. They were driven by pure rage and hatred. And unfortunately, I'm starting to see the exact same pattern of hatred towards Gen Z. It started with just demonizing a generation out of economic frustration, calling them a bunch of lazy parasites who don't want to work. Then when that didn't work, they had to turn up their hatred, calling them communists instead. And now, even in instances when it's not economically profitable to hate on Gen Z, they continue to do so purely out of spite. I made a video a while back discussing how you can use food banks to get by if you're one of many young people struggling to get by right now. This is literally leftover food from stores that would be thrown out and wasted anyways if no one eats it. Haters had a problem with that and called it communism, even though it had absolutely no negative impact on the taxpayer. Right now, AI is rapidly replacing jobs, and it doesn't even make sense from an economic standpoint to force people to work anymore. Yet these neo-Nazis are so filled with hatred that they're hell-bent on forcing everyone to work, even when it's no longer profitable to do so. The evidence is clear. History is repeating itself. But there's still plenty of time to recognize and stop it before it's too late. We just have to speak up, call it out, and fight back. So, if you like this historical type of video, you'll probably also like this video right here where we talk about how modern day Gen Z literally has to work twice as much as literal Roman slaves. Check it out. I'll see you there. Thanks for watching.